Good afternoon. My name is David Freeze, and this is the BESA webinar. And welcome back. It has a welcome back to the school term type of feel. Last day of summer, so I put on my tropical shirt because I'm not going to be wearing it very much longer, I fancy, in this weather. But welcome back anyways. First of our new season of webinars, all about how you survive in a time of shortage and uncertainty and price increases. According to Andrew Bailey from the Bank of England, the inflation that we're seeing at the moment will only last into next year. The economy looks like it'll be back at pre-pandemic levels next year, and that we'll deal with the skill shortages we're seeing across the board once furlough ends and people can move into those positions that are vacant. We'll find out today how you can help yourself overcome these uncertainties. But first, as ever, we'd like to welcome those companies who have joined BESA, who are on the right, too many to mention on this occasion, and all those who successfully passed our more robust technical assessment standard. Congratulations to all those companies. It's not easy, and we've raised the bar for BESA membership, so congratulations to all who have passed. As you can see, we're joined first off by Jenny House today, who's going to give us an update on the CBI. You've had a good summer, Jenny?
I've had a lovely summer, and it's definitely over here in Salisbury. It's now raining and windy, so yeah, hence I've got a jumper on today. Back to normal.
Back to normal. So what have the CBI had to say?
Well, yeah. Who would have thought we'd have been talking about labour shortages right now? It does seem crazy. I think anyone through the early stages of the pandemic and later on would have thought we'd be seeing mass unemployment. But what we're seeing played out in the media at the moment, obviously the HGV drivers are top of the news story. But the reality is it's not just drivers, this is hitting all sectors across the piece. And it's all seniority levels within companies as well. And it's from qualified accountants down to site labourers. So the CBI, they actually had a company on who are one of the main poultry suppliers in the UK. And they usually employ 7,000 people. They've got 800 vacancies at the moment. So you can imagine the impact on the supply chain, and hence why we're seeing no chicken in Nando's and now worrying about our Christmas turkeys. So this company's tried an awful lot of things to try and attract people in. None of it worked. They're at the point now where they've had to significantly increase their pay for all staff across the whole company. And of course, they're looking at their operational footprint, which will include moving premises. It'll include automation, all of those things that government want. But that takes time and investment, and it doesn't really help us in the short term. So realistically, CBI view is this is going to take us a couple of years to untangle and resolve all of this. And a lot of these issues, labour market issues were there before, skills issues were there before the pandemic. So it's still there, sitting there in the background. And they think we're going to need some targeted government action right now. Unfortunately, government at the moment, they don't seem to think it's a problem and it's all going to get resolved in short order and once furlough ends. But we know skills that come onto the market now, they're not going to match the skills requirements now, and they're not going to be in the right locations. So we think there are some levers that government can pull on training. They could flex the apprenticeship levy and get targeted funding into the areas where the skill shortages. But we could also use the powers that we have over our own immigration system. Drivers could be added to the shortage occupation list. And basically, we should be using that system to complement our skills now and to address any fluctuations in demand. As businesses, we've got the opportunity to change and be more nimble as well with the remote working and the hybrid working. And actually, you can look at a wider pool of people for employment. So the bit of advice at the end for businesses really is to, if you're looking for people, you need to speed up the interview processes because companies are losing people between first and second interviews, and be realistic on your requirements. You might need to narrow down to the list of essentials and not have so many desirables on there. Right at this minute, it's an employee's market, so you've got to sell yourself to them. Very different.
We've shifted actually to a period now where talent retention is a big thing. particularly things like digital skills. And once one person moves, it kind of opens the transfer window and you see people moving all over the shop, not for small increments either, for very, very large increments, big change. That's certainly something. I was on a CBI call yesterday as well. The view is the government will not shift on the HGV drivers. That's not going to change. And they think it's the industry, for the industry to solve. They're comfortable with wage inflation. They think that's a good thing. It will drive more people into those industries that require people. Anyway, shall we move on? Was that it? And you wanted to promote the jobs board. I presume that's why the slides are. Okay.
Exactly.
It's free to
Thank
members.
you.
Please use it. It's a great resource. So shall we kick off then with our first guest today, which is Iain Mcilwee from the Finishes and Interior Sectors, the FIS. Good morning, Iain.
Morning, David. Thanks for inviting me along today. I'm going to go straight into it because I've got quite a lot of areas to cover. So if I can have the next slide, please.
I shall disappear. I will see you all at the end on the Q&A.
I see you the other side, David. I think the one thing just looking at our sector, the one thing we're not short of is a list of things to talk about in terms of shortages. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour into the what's, whys and the pressures it's creating. But also as a quick intro, so FIS is the trade association for the Finishes Interior sector, which is mostly the construction bits that are done when the roof's on, the envelope's complete or should be complete, often it isn't, that you don't turn on or off. So the walls and the ceilings, the flooring. I think the big areas affecting us are the same as the big areas affecting that we're reading about in the newspaper at the moment. Steel is a major problem. We've got major drywall and ceiling manufacturers putting with metal on allocation. Ceiling grids is a problem. Cable trays, screws, fixings, fastenings have all been impacted. Timber's trading like gold at the moment. And I think sometimes when we think about timber, we forget about how wide the use of timber is in the sector. I mean, plasterboard is effectively gypsum mixed between paper, and again, it's the paper that's causing us the big issues at the moment. So challenges of availability, lead times, bag cement, any of the polymeric materials, insulation, plastics, coatings. Jewson's put out a price warning on sealants this morning. So again, it really is right the way across the piece. And I've tried to categorize some of the reasons why around a bunch of P's. So the first one being pipeline. Construction has come back quicker than I think any of us would have expected at the start of the pandemic. I don't talk to anyone at the moment who isn't busy. This I could have pulled up for a myriad of different charts. This is the PMI UK Construction Output Index, and you can just see sort of those three key sectors of residential, commercial, and civil engineering, sort of really just motoring forward. So because housing is a big area of drive for us, but commercial as well. And I think it sometimes feels a bit counterintuitive because we're talking about the future of the office, but we are seeing quite a lot of office activity. And I think if you look in London at the moment, which is the biggest area of investment for offices, and there's about 14 million square foot of work going on at the moment, which is a little bit less than the peak, but beyond the norm. So again, we are seeing this. People are using the opportunity to invest in space. We've tipped a little bit, so now refurbs about 60% of what's going on, and new builds at about 40%. But again, that's probably going to settle out and balance over the next 12 months. And if I have the next slide, please. I'll hit slide, suppose, and I'll jump onto the next one as well. Sorry. And in terms of optimism, so next slide, please. In terms of the optimism, it's still there. So we are still seeing our members being very positive about the future over the next 12 months. So the pipeline. So in terms of is there going to be any respite because of pipeline? I don't think so. I think it's more likely that the shortages will slow the growth than the growth will alleviate the shortages. And I think the other thing, that first slide I put up, you have to remember is we are working in a global economy. Increasingly global. When we talk about products like timber, 80% of it is imported. So it's not just what's happening here. We've seen a huge surge in construction consumption in China, and the US is running. I think the US construction industry is about 15% up last year, and last year wasn't as bad as many expected. And the long-term growth forecast there is about 4 to 5%. And I think that's pretty much before we factor in the fact that Biden got through last month a £2 trillion investment plan to push forward on the roads, the development of rebuild of roads, repairs of bridges, There's been a couple of bridge collapses in America that have drawn attention to that, and they're eliminating lead pipes in the whole of their water supply network, plus huge investment in rail as well. So really, in that global economy, construction is performing fairly well, and everybody's trying to build back better. So I'll have the next slide, please. I'll just jump through this one very quickly, but again, one of the big things I think that's driving change or causing problems in the supply chain, I'm going to sandwich a bit of good news and bad news, is that the pandemic has really caused hiatus and challenges through what is now a just-in-time supply chain. So stocks have been depleted, and all of that is going to take a time to work through. If I could have the next slide, please. In terms of other things that have held us up and caused these problems, it's the iron ore. We've had shutdowns in Brazil because of the Bermudo Dam, and we've had plant issues in Australia, particularly affecting the iron ore side. So that's part of this issue with steel. And I think, you know, to talk to people in the steel industry, they think it's probably towards the end of the year before we'll see that really any of that sort of stock depletion and production concern really starting to come through in terms of or really starting to move beyond. And again, the polymer materials, a lot of it was crude oil production issues earlier in the year that wiped out capacity. So again, it's taken a while for the plants to come back up. It's taken a while for the stocks to build up. And you've effectively got this air bubble, which is slowly working its way through the system. If I have the next slide, please. And my next P is politics. You know, the fact that the US and China are locked in a trade war isn't helping. Those tensions are definitely causing issues around stocking and flow. And of course, logistics, which I'll come to, is very reliant on how material moves around and flows. Got tensions in the Middle East building again. And Brexit, I think we're probably all a bit surprised how little we're talking about Brexit in terms of macro impact, but there's still a huge unknown quantity around Brexit, and particularly when we look at materials like timber, you know, traded globally, the bureaucratic weight of bringing timber in is going up. So the reason to bring it in is becoming less because people can't make as much money from selling it here. They'll sell it where they can maximize their profit. You know, I worked in the timber industry for 10 years, and I think it was always depressing to hear where we thought we were getting some supply, and it ended up as toilet roll in Iran or something. You know, you could lose your supply because there's more profitable places to put it. So again, I think the politics and particularly for us at the moment, areas like suspended ceilings, where there's new CE marking, UKCA marking requirements coming through. Yeah, the extension of the next 12 months has been before we have to apply the UKCA mark was really welcome. But again, all we've done really is kick the can down the road. So some of these marking issues may or may not, over the next 12 months, start to kick in. Next slide, please. People. Jenny mentioned the shortage of people. And there's loads of numbers kicked around on this. I think if we look at our biggest footprint area at the moment, it's dry lining. And just to run the numbers past you and how short we are of labour, there's around 60,000 people in the UK do dry line. So 60,000 people working in the trade. And we estimate that means we need about 1,200 a year just to stand still, natural churn. So people leaving the industry for whatever reason, be it retirement or finding something else they'd rather do. So we think the natural churn is about 1,200 a year. Our workforce going into 2019, coming into the start of 2020, the pandemic, was round about 40% EU worker. So give or take 24,000 people. So 24,000 of our 60,000 were from the EU. If we think about that number, for every 5% of EU workers that decide not to remain, that's 5% of our, so if every 5%, that's doubled our annual recruitment target. So that's another 1,200 people we've got to find. And we were already struggling to fill the 1,200. The other thing to bear in mind behind that is that some of those 1,200 were new, fresh imports from the European Union, give or take half of the people coming over. So I think about it in terms of a school. With a school, 1,200, we need a school to dry line, there's 1,200 people to keep going. We've relied on 600 students to be, from an exchange student perspective, so 600 of the seats in our school are now empty. And so we're already short by 600 this year. And then for every 5% that leave, we've got to build another school. The numbers are quite scary when you think about them in that context. And we think our annual recruitment target's gone up by about 300% this year alone. And the truth is we don't know how bad it is because we're still waiting for the summer hiatus to end. So we were out on the deer last month with extended summer holidays, and if looking at some work schedules for members, your workforce was pretty much redded out with people going away for 4-6 weeks, bearing in mind that we rely heavily on self-employed labour. So next slide, please. Logistics, I couldn't think of a P for logistics, and I'm a lazy man, but the shortage of lorry drivers Jenny's talked about. We've got, we had the Suez Dam, nothing's where it should be, and everything's taken a while to sort itself out. So again, the logistics is going to take a while to pull through, and also in our sector, in terms of distribution, the stocks are very much depleted. So we are sort of working on the bones of our bum now at the moment. So next slide, please. I should have mentioned shipping containers there as well. I think shipping container costs have gone from about 1,800 quid to 14,000. I was talking to somebody the other day that was complaining that the box and the boat was cost more than the ceiling now, which seems counterintuitive. Other areas that we look at, other P's, profiteering, inevitably off the back of this, some of those price hikes will be down to companies looking to find an excuse to push them through. So there is some of that undoubtedly going on. And there's two other areas we're short of. One is insurance and insurance cover, and the other is productivity and areas around which we've got to cut the waste. But ultimately, there's a little bit of shortage of trust in construction, which is undermining what we're trying to do as a sector and making insurance more difficult to secure. Next slide, please, and the final one. Next slide, sorry. The impact, and I guess others will come onto this, but the impact, this is quite an interesting slide in terms of that top right is inflation and materials, and that bottom left is the inflation in headline contract price from the MACE index. So what you can see there is we're getting price hikes for materials of about 20%, but headline contract spikes of around 1.5% to 2.5%. So on the fixed price contracts we're working on, the pressure on the specialists in our sector is immense. We're not holding quotes for very long, but there's still daily price hikes that are creating huge pressure. And labour rates, I mean, I was talking to somebody last week who was trying to secure a dry liner in Cambridge, and the normal rate for dry liner would be somewhere about 150, 180, and there was rates being banded around £300 a day. And again, when you're working on a fixed price contract, that's pretty horrendous, especially when we're not seeing those headline, those top level prices giving any bandwidth or any support to the specialists. So we're seeing a big squeeze on the packages, both from the labour spikes, price spikes, plus the materials price spikes. Margins are challenged, and we are starting to see fluctuation clauses. I know Ruth will come and talk about fluctuation clauses, but I'm not sure we really know how to use them as a sector, because we've had to blow the dust off them from contracts in the 1970s, and they've been very rarely used ever since. So that's a very quick whistle stop tour from me. I'm going to hand across now to Ed Kendall, who's a distributor member at the British Metal Tube and Fixings Association. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, as Ian says, I'm an employee of a UK distributor and a member of the BMTFA, the British Metal Tube and Fittings Association, that represents members involved in the manufacture and distribution of metal tubes and fittings in the UK, primarily for the building services and industrial market. Next slide, please. Ian's obviously just been through, and to be fair, many of the influences that Ian's just touched upon are the same influences that we are experiencing in the metal tube and fittings market as well. It's fair to say that I think all BMTFA members would agree that at some stage over the last couple of years, they have experienced some form of product availability challenge or shortage, but the severity is dependent on supplier, product, range, depth, breadth, timings. Everything has been varied, and there have been many different options. In many cases, the impacts of these causes is still being felt and still being addressed. But in this presentation, I'll try and provide a little bit more information on some of the impacts on production, logistics, and pricing, and then briefly touch on a couple of suggestions for minimizing the impact. Next slide, please. So from a production point of view, the past year, nearly 2 years, has seen what some have described as the perfect storm a classic supply and demand squeeze. Worldwide construction has clearly increased since lockdowns have eased, whether it be copper, steel, iron, all these materials that go into tube and fittings. The COVID pandemic has resulted in a restriction of supply. As demand's reduced, production was reduced and stocks depleted, as Iain said before. And as lockdowns have eased, so we've seen the increase in infrastructure and the supply has not been able to ramp up as quickly. Supply chains have sought alternative routes, perhaps closer to home, and these alternatives have not always had the capacity to cope or the ability to adapt as quickly as required. With raw materials, production and manufacturing takes place in various countries, and the impacts have varied by material, product, and country of origin in terms of how that's had an impact on the availability and shortages. As well as COVID, we've also had issues with the climate, as Iain again mentioned Brazil, but floods in China, droughts in Chile. In Chile, there's talk of copper a couple of weeks ago that having to use desalinated water because there isn't sufficient water for the mining. And the storms in the likes of the USA, all impacting on production, supply, and how we get that product into the UK. As the world focuses on reducing the impact of climate change, government policies also are resulting in supply chain effects for the metal market and for other materials as well. It's not unique, as Iain just went through in terms of his product ranges as well. All of this has a knock-on effect to the availability. Jenny and Iain both referred to the labour shortages that have clearly impacted on us as well, whether that be drivers, whether that be warehouse operatives, whether that be machinists, whether that be tradespeople. And that's not just in the UK, that's had the same impact all over the world and has affected our production and supply. And the other mention again that Iain made was around standards and changes in marking. So with Brexit, we've had to change with the UKCA marking, and manufacturers and producers are having changes that are delaying their production, and standards such as changes to European standards for the likes of steel tube is clearly having an impact on what is produced, capacity, and therefore availability into the market. Having said all that, producers, manufacturers, distributors have worked tirelessly to overcome these negative effects. Things like the use of scrap, redeployment and recruitment of labour, and plenty more has helped to try and minimise the impact that the production has had on our availability. Can I have the next slide, please? So having said that production is clearly heavily involved, in actual fact, from a BMTFA member's point of view, the consensus is actually the bigger impact has really been on the logistics and the lead times that have extended as a result of different elements of the logistics position. So COVID clearly is behind and has been a big cause of this. And as I say, it's that whole element of the whole storm. In individual circumstances, a number of these have happened for years and years. It's the fact they've all come together. So stocks have been reduced, which has meant that we've had to be fed from direct production. Iain referred to containers, that availability of where containers are. They're in the wrong place, they're in high demand, not just for our industry, but for every other industry as well. And as such, trying to get onto getting a container and then getting onto vessels has really been a massive issue. There've been transportation challenges then, in addition to that, with port delays, access restrictions, rerouting, all causing further delays that's had an impact on the availability of products coming into the UK. There's also been the environmental considerations. So vessels coming in from the Far East and elsewhere are operating on a slower boat, helping to ensure that they reduce their emissions and use the correct fuel to actually help that climate position. And this again is having an impact on the lead times and the logistics. Brexit, a lot of impact again on our documentation coming across borders, how we operate, time it takes to get product through into the market. This again has had an impact on our logistics offer, how it works, and how we get our product in, and the availability and shortages that we have in certain instances experienced. And again, Jenny's referred to it for the UK, but shortage of labour, it hasn't just affected the UK, it's affected absolutely everywhere. The COVID pandemic, as Iain said, the pingdemic, but this has affected China, India, Europe, the UK, all of this, again, affecting the lead times on logistics and how we bring product, and therefore the availability of metal tube, fittings, and every other product coming into the UK. Can I have the next slide, please? So the impact of production, the impact of logistics, clearly that whole supply and demand is having an impact on our prices. Economies of scale, supply and demand, it's a natural rise. Just on the right-hand side, I just picked out 2 examples of raw material changes that have taken place over the last 2 years. It's the London Metal Exchange, LME graphs, the top one being copper, the bottom one being hot rolled coil for steel coming from China. I could have picked any number of slides, any number of graphs to show the increases that have come through. On the top slide, copper, in US dollars, the price today is 18% higher than it was at the start of the year. That's 51% higher than it was at the start of last year. On the steel graph, the US price is 48% higher than it was at the start of the year and 89% higher than it was at the start of 2020. Containers, Iain mentioned it. I had it on mine as well. The cost of containers has increased. I had $1,400 up to $10,000 to $14,000 for a container. When you've got product that's coming in where the containers are of a greater value than the product that's filling it, that has a massive impact on the cost increase on landed cost coming into the UK. Duties and tariff changes, all the impact that that's had. So Brexit, that's led to changes in anti-dumping levies. It's affected surcharges. The Chinese, for example, have removed export charges, surcharges. They've added other charges in to help protect their own infrastructure, make sure product is available when they demand it into their own markets. This has all had another impact on the prices that we're seeing and the cost it is of a product when it comes into the UK. The shortage of labour, the high demand, the increase in wages, in salaries that are required to help ensure that we do get product in, it's all impacting on the price of the product that we see. And again, fuel and energy, Iain again referred to the oil price that's changed over the time and has increased as demand and supply has affected it. That too has had a massive impact on what happens and how we move things forward. And clearly, again, on the shortage of labour, there's been a big impact that if we have been able to get that product into the UK, we may not have been able to transport it around the UK quick enough, all impacting on our decision making in terms of when we can get product and what we can inform our customers and the whole supply chain as to when that product's going to be available for everyone to get hold of. Next slide, please. So in terms of minimising the impacts, the top and bottoms in my mind and in the mind of the BMTFA is simple. It really is around the communication that we work together. It's around having good communication all the way through the supply chain, working closely with suppliers and customers to manage the expectations, the needs, and the priorities. There is not the possibility now just to rely on past experience and assumptions, where in the past we used to work on short lead times for a number of our fittings, our flanges, our tube. We as a supply chain with the BMTFA membership, suppliers, distributors, manufacturers are working to maintain and grow our stocks to help ensure that we maintain and deliver short lead times. But whatever has been the case in the past, in terms of the expectation, there are individual products at individual times that are now not available on the same sort of lead time they were before. It's therefore important that wherever possible, the close communication allows for better forecasting, better planning. It will help with stock management. It will help with allocation of product to make sure it's in the right place at the right time. It will help with availability. Lead times, they change. Being able to work closely with suppliers and customers will help guide and advise what the lead time on a product is, how it's changed, what's happening. It's not always that simple though. As I said about the logistics, products are getting shipped around the country, around the world. They may get diverted. Transportation may move over to other parts, and port delays allowing for differences in timings of when products are going to arrive. So when as a membership, the distributors, the manufacturers are quoting lead times and quoting dates, they're on the best advice of the information we've got at the moment, but they cannot always be guaranteed unless that stock is free and available at a moment in time. And clearly, by communicating closely together, we can help work on prices, understand what's happening to product, help understand which products are moving up, when they're moving up, and try and advise what might be happening in the future. Finally, there's the alternatives. As I said before, the BMTFA membership have all been working on alternatives, whether that be alternative sources, whether that's raw material, production sites, whether that's finding alternative ports to bring product in to help reduce those lead times and improve availability, whether that's finding alternative routes, whether it by sea, whether it by rail, whether it by road. All of these things are there to try and help, and clearly any help with communication, planning and forecasting will make that easier for us to deliver and meet the requirements of the whole supply chain. Also within alternatives, there's also the piece around specification. By communicating with your supplier base, it gives the opportunity to understand what specifications required, what's required to meet the application in place. The BMTFA members are all available to help with that. It might be that there's an overspec pressure rating that we are out of stock of at a moment in time. It might be that we can re-engineer that to ensure that we still meet the application, provide the right specification, don't over specify. These are the sort of things that the BMTFA members can certainly help with by working on that communication. Outside of that, it may be there are alternatives of different products, but they may be metal, they may be other materials, but those other materials, again, are experiencing exactly the same problems, cost challenges, logistics challenges that we in the BMTFA are also experiencing. I'd now like to pass over to Ruth Wilkinson, Specialist Construction and Engineering Solicitor working for Hill Dixon in London.
Thank you, Ed. I'm delighted to be here and today, and Iain and Ed, between them, have very clearly set out that the issues relating to materials and availability and cost are due to a whole host of different factors, and of course likely to last for some time ahead. Now, my job and my role is to consider how the contract might deal with the uncertainties and risks associated with the current issues with the unavailability and cost of materials. So in my brief slot today, I'm going to look at how the standard form contracts deal with it, and then also try and advise on some possible tips when you're negotiating and trying to agree new contracts. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've kind of roughly compared the provisions of the JCT design and build and the NEC for engineering and construction contract. I'm not going to have time today to go through the NEC for in any particular detail, and if anybody's got any queries on that after this webinar, I'm happy to look at those or to talk about those in more detail. I wanted to focus on the JCT form in particular because this is the most common form of contract, the most common suite that's used in UK domestic projects and covers around 70% of those projects. When I would note that although I'm going to talk about the standard form contract, it's very, very common for the standard form to be supplemented by a schedule of amendments that changes and adds contract-specific provisions, and also usually make some amendment to the list of relevant events, which is those events which entitle the contractor to an extension of time. The starting point with the JCT is that the contractor is appointed by the employer to carry out specific work for an agreed price by reference to the employer's requirements. In effect, it's a fixed price contract, and the contractor is only entitled to recover additional cost or time as provided for by the provisions of the contract. So I've tried to distill in this table some of the key points to pick upon. And the first is this point about being a fixed price contract. And Iain has already mentioned the possibility of using fluctuations provisions. And of course, the JCT contract does make provision for fluctuations. These are options that need to be incorporated into the contract. There's three options, options A, B, and C. And a fluctuations is a way to deal with the effect of inflation, which may include price increases. As Iain mentioned earlier, these have not been used for many years and are routinely struck out in the contract particulars and in the schedule of amendments. And I think if you did want to look at using the fluctuations options, you would need to take specialist advice and review those carefully, both with your legal advisors and also with a quantity surveyor. So as I said, it's quite unusual for fluctuations to apply in existing contracts. The other kind of key point to know about the JCT contract in relation to claiming for an extension of time is that the contractor is expressly under a positive obligation to mitigate any delay to the works. So all the things that Ed was talking about, the ways that you could try to minimise the effect of delay, the planning, the programming, etc., are things that you should be looking at doing under the JCT contract. So, for example, you should be investigating alternative forms of procurement and alternative sequencing that might reduce the effect of the delay. The other issue that Ed also spoke about was specifying the materials, and he spoke about over specifying and using different pipework, for example. Now, under the terms of the JCT contract, the contractor is under an obligation to use materials so far as procurable, and if materials are specified, he can only substitute those materials with the employer's consent. So if materials need to be changed, then you need to seek the employer's consent for that and a subsequent variation. And that variation should entitle you to claim additional time and money. The grounds that you can claim a extension of time and hence relief from liquidated damages are described in the JCT form of contract as relevant events. I've listed a few on the slide, and they include changes and variations in the work, an instruction to postpone the works, an act of prevention by the employer, and force majeure. For the purposes of today's talk, I was going to focus on force majeure, and this is one of the grounds which may be relevant to you if you've got issues with materials unavailability and delays in procurement. Now, force majeure isn't defined in the JCT standard form. It is sometimes defined in the schedule of amendments, so you need to check that. Force majeure applies to exceptional events that could not be contemplated at the time of entering into the contract and make performance practically impossible. So quite a high test to follow. And for example, I would note that it's probably unlikely that it would be force majeure if it is merely more difficult or costly to obtain those materials. I flag also the role of the employer's agent under the JCT form of contract, and it might be that the employer's agent, as part of its role to manage the contract, should encourage the parties to take a pragmatic approach. So actually be encouraging the parties to agree a variation which allows for the substitution of materials to allow progress of works on site. The final point in relation to the JCT in particular is in relation to relevant matters. So under the JCT, you're entitled to time if you can get it under the ground of a relevant event, and only loss and expense if it's a relevant matter. The list of relevant matters is not the same as the list of relevant events. It's shorter, and it doesn't include force majeure. The reason why this is relevant is it may be that as a result of any delay that's caused by obtaining those materials, you may incur additional costs of being on site and further disruption that you would like to recover. As I mentioned at the outset, I don't have time today to go through the NEC 4 contract. I was merely going to just highlight that rather than speaking about relevant events and relevant matters in the NEC contract, you have what's called compensation events. These are in a slightly different format to those under the JCT contract and need to be reviewed carefully. in relation to both the JCT and the NEC form of contract. And in fact, any contract that you've entered into, it's imperative that you comply with any notice provisions and any requirements that exist in relation to the format and content of those notices. If you fail to comply with those requirements or any time limits, there is a risk that you may fall foul of a condition precedent and lose your entitlement to that claim. So they need to be checked very, very carefully indeed. Next slide, please. So I said at the outset that I would give you some possible tips in relation to negotiating a new contract. Iain and Ed have already set out some practical things that could be done in order to try and mitigate delays and to deal with the issue of the non-availability. And I don't want to repeat those today, so I want to highlight a few of those items that I've included on this slide. The first is to consider using advance payment, so that you can secure early orders of any particular materials. Usually if you require advance payment in exchange, the employer will want an advance payment bond, which means that they will be able to recover those monies in the event of default by you. In addition, if they are paying upfront for goods or materials, they may wish to have a vesting certificate in those goods to ensure that ownership of those passes when payment has been made. The second point that I wanted to make was in relation to the terms that you have with your subcontractors and suppliers. Ideally, these should be on back-to-back terms. I understand that this sometimes is not achievable, and if that isn't possible, then you need to assess and identify what the gaps are and what the risk is and how best you might manage that up the line. The third point is we've talked about the relevant events and the compensation events, and whilst there are some in the existing standard forms that may assist in your particular circumstances, if you anticipate that you are going to have a particular problem with non-availability of materials, you may wish to consider putting a specific clause in the contract to deal with this and entitling you to time and/or money. We've seen quite a few clauses over the last 18 months or so relating to the pandemic, and then before that in relation to Brexit. Some of those are still kicking about, but I am also increasingly seeing now specific clauses relating to the non-availability of materials, which include a whole number of causes, whether it's because they're tied up at ports or whether because they're just not available, etc. And in relation to those, I think you need to be specific about which materials they are and what the particular issues that you are concerned about, so that any clause can capture that. Also, we talked about fluctuations clauses, and I said right at the beginning that these have been very unusual for a very, very long time. There does seem to be a willingness, in my experience, for people to consider fluctuation provisions. There also seems to be a willingness to explore bespoke provisions that talk about the parties sharing the risk, or one or other party taking the risk of increased cost of those materials. So remember that the relevant event and the relevant matters, they deal with the delay associated with that, but not usually the increased cost of those materials. And if you want the increased cost, then that needs to be provided for elsewhere, whether that's by fluctuations, and the question of course is whether they will actually apply or are relevant, or by this bespoke provision that needs to be included. The final point is in relation to considering your rights to termination. So as it stands, usually the employer has more wide-ranging rights to terminate than the contractor. The contractor can usually only terminate if the employer is in breach, for example, it's not paid. If you feel you may want to consider that if you can't obtain materials for a particular price, or with a percentage on top of that for that price, so if it exceeds a certain amount, you may want to consider including a specific termination right to enable you to walk away from a contract that's going to be very unprofitable for you, and in fact, cause serious financial problems for your business. So that's me. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to David.
Thank you, Ruth. And if I could invite Ed and Iain back. I'm going to kick off with Ed, actually. Ed, when do you think that the material availability issues is going to be resolved, and then what do you think will happen to prices going forward?
Oh, that forecast and hope with the crystal ball, David. I think in terms of the material shortages, obviously the comments you made at the start about this not necessarily going too far into next year. I think with the issue of containers and the logistics particularly, I think this could be something that does go for a little bit longer than perhaps has been suggested in the news at the moment. But trying to predict how long that will be, it's really very difficult to tell at the moment. And as I say, it very much does vary by product. So you look at copper versus steel versus iron, there are very definitely differences. And again, depending on where the products are being sourced from, whether that be Europe, Far East, or elsewhere around the world, then clearly the whole process of production and of production logistics can really change how long that's going to take. But I do think that it's going to be the containers and the labor shortages that I think are going to be the key elements that are going to drive when availability is actually going to really improve. But clearly there's a lot of work going on with the BMTFA membership, manufacturers and distributors to increase our stock levels and make sure that we're in a place to service and maintain supply into our customers as best we can. I think
so we'll be living with sort of daily changing copper prices for quite a while, you think?
I think that daily changing copper price is absolutely. I think again, it's one of those that who knows where it will go. As I showed on the graph, it really does change daily, up and down. I think it's one of those that, yes, I probably wouldn't be here if I could forecast what was going to happen. But speaking to the membership, I think there's a general consensus that the demand for copper is not going to reduce with what's going on with the renewable products coming into the market that certainly need copper. And with the amount of infrastructure that is increasing around the world for steel, there is certainly a big question as to how or when those prices are going to settle down.
And Iain, what's your view of the interiors market? When do you think it will settle down?
Again, it's difficult. I think people are asking very serious questions now about the resilience of their supply chain and looking at how globalized and how exposed they are to certain risks in certain part of the world. In terms of prices, I mean, there's that old adage, what goes up must come down. I don't think I've ever read a headline, price warning, prices coming down by 25% today. You know, it's going to take a while for things to get back to a new normal. And I suspect we are in a slightly different world now where we're going to be looking at sustainability of supply chain and resilience of supply chain in a very different way.
So what sort of changes do you expect to see?
I expect we'll start to see people hedging their bets a little bit. So if there's an over-reliance on, say, steel from China, they may be looking for other places in which they can secure material. I think people are going to be asking more serious questions about the sustainability of product moving forward, linked to the whole net zero agenda. And we're already seeing that creeping in. I don't know if people saw Wilmot Dixon's latest line of credit is reliant on their environmental performance. So they're going to have to start asking questions that may be uncomfortable, and we may get some uncomfortable answers that's going to cause us to look at where we're securing material from.
So yeah, there's a reason why our legal department is the biggest department in BESA. Because it always gets legal. So Ruth, what's your top tip for contractors or subcontractors with a possible claim for time or money for delayed supply of materials?
So my top tip is to keep good records. So records. The first thing that I ask when anybody comes to me with a possible claim is, what have you got to show me? What can I look at that evidences your claim? And you need to keep records not just of any increased costs or difficulties in obtaining those materials, but also evidence of what you have done in order to comply with your obligation to mitigate your position and try to avoid that delay. So what alternatives have you looked at, and why have they not been successful? Why have they not worked out? So, and if I can add a second tip, the first tip would be to keep good records. The second tip would be to make sure that you get your notices out in the correct format and on time, and don't lose your claim just because of a technical breach of the contract.
So if we then look on sort of the other side, if you're a consultant or a client, what do you need to agree in the professional services agreements to ensure that there is fair play across all the parties and they operate for the project's best interests?
Well, that should be, I don't think you'd probably have to include any particular amendments in relation to that, because that is usually one of the conditions of that appointment. You appointed, the employer is appointing that consultant to act as effectively an independent party in terms of administering that contract. And I assume you're talking about my reference to the employer's agent under the JCT contracts, and whether or not they should be trying to encourage the parties to cooperate and find a solution.
Yes, I think that's what's meant by the question. Yes. One final question on that. It's one thing saying you negotiate clauses within the contract. It's quite often the case that it's take it or leave it. Do you want the job or don't you want the job? How should members deal with that kind of approach?
Well, I mean, this is part of, I suppose, of the psychology of negotiating, and I think with some employers and some main contractors, that may be their negotiating strategy, but it doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. And I think the point that's been made by everybody here today is about the importance of communicating the issues, and I think also being specific about the problem that you're facing and why it needs to be addressed, and why it can't be just dealt with in the same way that things have been dealt with over the past 10, 15, 20 years or whatever. And that's certainly in my experience over the last few months in dealing with this particular issue, there does seem to have been a willingness to engage with issues of materials unavailability and delays, because it's something that you can't, it's not something you can bury your head in the sand about, because it's on the front page of Construction News. I think Iain's even made the Financial Times talking about it.
He has, yes.
Is it fair to say, Ruth, as well, that the one of the things is people have to be aware where the risks are in the contracts that they're signing. So there may be times in which people have to accept the contract they're being given, but if you don't ask, you don't get. And quite often, I think, I dealt with an inquiry from a member last week who, when we spoke on the phone, he was absolutely adamant he had no design liability. No design liability. I'm building to the client's design. When you look at the contract, line 4. He's responsible for checking the design. He does have some design liability. And I think that's an area that we're concerned. We talked about a lack of trust in the supply chain. If we're having to use people who are less confident because we're having to use labour rather than skilled labour just to get the job done, if we're starting to erode specifications, what additional risks are we taking through? And are we really checking our sort of contractual obligations and managing those effectively? I think that's something that we're really trying to emphasise with our community at the moment. Design liability is being squeezed through the supply chain, and the specialist contractors are often being stuck with more than is fair and more than is reasonable.
Yeah, but if the subcontractor doesn't have many assets, it's an illusory thing of pushing it down the supply chain, isn't it? Because it comes back to you. One question also from the audience today is this it? You've described pretty much, a pretty bad, I think you described it as the 3 Ps, Iain, of the politics, the logistics, and I can't remember, the product, I think, was the first P. Is there any other stuff that we've yet to see that'll feed through the pipeline in the coming year or years? Ed, are you expecting any other upsets that are just on the horizon coming through?
I think I'm not really aware of too many that we can see, but as I said before, it's that perfect storm of what in the past has been individual instances that have been managed by the supply chain. I think it's the fact they've all come together, and I think that's been a major impact on the availability that we've seen into the market recently. I'd like to think, and as per the previous question, that things will ease, that containers will be in the right place, that we will be able to manage it through. But it's one of those that we just can't really predict. But in the meantime, it's about the robust supply chain and making sure that as manufacturers, as distributors, and as customers, contractors, clients, that supply chain is managed, and we try and minimize and mitigate as many of the issues as possible as they arise.
And Iain, do you see anything else coming?
I think you've got to look, so there is a perfect storm, and in the perfect storm you've kind of got all the waves on the water, but there is a current and it's pushing us in a direction. So I do feel that things are moving in a certain direction, but a lot of it, I don't think we should view it all as negative. we know in construction we've got issues around planning and program. These kind of issues are forcing us to look at that and potentially involve, transformation is going to involve change. And the way that we plan, the way we procure construction is going to have to change to deliver transformation. And these are levers of change. So it's I think it's really hard to deal with at the moment because it's all in the now, it's all instant. But as we start to plan better and start to deal with these issues moving forward in our plans and our programs, then potentially there'll be ways of strengthening what we do as a supply chain and improve how we perform as a construction sector. And also, I made a flippant comment about us working inside when the envelope's finished. Too often we're still working in damp environments and having to redo work. If we could stop reworking, that probably saves about 10% of our material out there. So just doing things like that, we can drive some positive change.
Here's a top tip for the sealing and the dry liners. Wait till the services are finished. You might find it a bit easier. Ruth, do you expect anything?
Well, I don't. I dread to think if anything else can come and hit us at the moment, given we're living in these current times. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that we are at the moment. I'm seeing more contracts being negotiated to try and deal with materials unavailability. And I think to pick up on Iain's point, in order to do that, I think there's probably been more openness and transparency about the challenges that might be facing the contractor on a particular project. And if that, to the extent that I think that might be good for the future of the industry, then I think that might be a positive thing that comes out of this challenge.
So overall, then we're pessimistic about the way it is at the moment, but see it as a relatively short-term thing that actually will drive innovation and drive us to do things in a better way. Is that it? Basically, taking what I think Iain was suggesting, that actually will drive innovation, particularly planning, program, digitization. Is that what we're all seeing?
I certainly feel that would be correct, and I think it is that efficiencies and meeting of standards and absolutely those innovations to try and keep things moving forward.
Excellent.
I think I agree with David.
Is there anything else any of you want to raise? I'll try to finish these on time. Is there any other points you'd like to make before we disappear?
No, I think you made the point there, David, about collaboration. And I think one of the things I really do hope that this drives is better collaboration between, I know BESA and FIS are working much more closely together than ever before. If we could replicate that through our supply chains, get that early engagement, get that sort of project planning teams together earlier, we can make this a better industry.
Indeed. And on that optimistic note, I'd like to say thank you to Ruth, Iain and Ed. Excellent presentations, a great way to kick off the new season. So thank you all very much. I'd just like to say to BESA members who are listening, actually, if you want your contracts checked, then we have a legal department. It's part of your member service. So please take advantage of it. That's what they're there for. And just one case can save you your subscription fee over and over again. So use them. They're waiting for your calls. We've got some other webinars coming up in this new season. On the 14th September, the carbon reduction code for the built environment, and on the 21st, closing that skills gap. So can we do what I suspect some politicians feel is take someone from Next and 6 weeks later have them installing heat pumps? If not, what's the answer? So on that note, thank you all again to our participants. Don't forget, we have our conference coming up. You can book now. Great speakers are lined up for that. Thank you very much, Charlie, for going back to that. 3rd, 4th of November, a really, really good conference full of great speakers. So sign up for that now. And on that note, I'll say thank you and good afternoon, and we'll see you again shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks.